As far as she's been willing to go is in that discussion of self-interest and rationality. What she'll say is that self-interest is more complicated than just individual self-interest, and that there is something to wanting to preserve human life and human flourishing that indirectly has a benefit to oneself and to one's children. And she does have kids that she very much, loves and wants the best for. And so she'll say, yeah, there has to be something greater than that. But then she's not willing to go any further than that. And what she would just say is that that is part of self-interest, that self-interest extends beyond oneself and goes to one's future.
This is Generous Theology. Today, Chuck and Brock enjoy spending time with Professor Miko Ear John Surrey's Chapter 34, Identity and Moral Agency, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Why is that? What is the purpose? Why did you have children then? Because in some ways, having children in a lot of ways goes against one's self-interest in a lot of ways, unless you think of it as just somehow being fulfilling. And she's struggled to get beyond that. And I think, and as I've pointed out, I think part of the reason that she struggled to get beyond that is if we say that as individuals, we in some way become more self-fulfilled by passing something of ourselves on to another generation. And yet, in order to do that, we have to give something up for that next generation. That there's something that doesn't quite compute without there being something bigger, something greater, some greater purpose, some greater direction. And she hasn't been willing to go any further than that. We don't have a ton of deep discussions like, this is probably what I've described here probably adds up to probably a couple of years worth of brief conversations on things like this. Those are important things to think about. And going back to think about even who are we as humans plays a role in thinking about what is self-interest and what is rationality, and is there something bigger? So yeah, I don't know that I've necessarily answered anything beyond what the professor has done as far as how he's asked those questions here, but it is I felt that it made some sense to ask those questions in the way that he asked them, and consider those things in the order that he did.
Yeah, well said, Chuck. In some sense, this is a complicated topic, and it's not easy to make sweeping generalizations. And yet, that's where we need to go if these studies are to be useful. Now, interestingly enough, we have this idea in the medieval period as an age of faith. And perhaps we can see the content, as the professors outlined it here, as a struggle between two worldviews. And so you have, in the age of faith, you have as a given, you have a default presumption or presupposition, this relationship between humankind and God, as described in the Christian scriptures. But the challenge to the age of faith and the medieval thinking, which sometimes came in a measured and careful way, even within the church, is this idea of where should ethics originate from, and what's the balance between an ethic that is derived externally and one that's internally. And what I meant by these two movements interacting, the professor here cites John Duns Scotus as an example of a medieval thinker who is starting in this distinctively modern way. And so the Scotus thesis is acting rationally, which is this idea of optimal ethical behavior. Acting rationally means acting for one's own individual best interests. And so you have, in a sense there, at least conceptually, maybe a replacement of the external Christian lawgiver with this idea of acting in one's own individual best interests. Now, it's not just as simple as that, and Scotus is, of course, not advocating for this in an atheistic way. But here you and I are, Chuck, and we're trying to get through the days of our lives. And the modern way wishes to acknowledge that one of the most powerful tools for evaluating, working through things, and acting is one's own individual best interests. Now, you might have heard it perhaps placed in a more secular way, And so I think you have some secularists in this time period, the late medieval, the early Renaissance time period. You have some secular thinkers who challenge external ideas of law giving and obedience to authority. And they'll make arguments and claims along the lines of something like, if God gave me a brain, doesn't that imply that I'm to use it? And what they mean by that, at least in the good sense, is that this individual human faculty is a powerful one, if well trained, if properly oriented, if it's well informed. I think that's the best of modernism. I think that's the best of liberalism. Now, where it might go off the rails from our Christian perspective is when you or I, Chuck, have to make a decision where our own impulses might wish to drive us in one direction. You and I come to a fork in the road, and we're in the road, and there's a left-hand fork and there's a right-hand fork, and I decide it's in our best interest to go to the right, and you evaluate the understanding, and you say, I think it's best to go to the left. This puts us in an interesting situation, and where the secularists took it even further into something that I think you and I would both object to is this idea of it's not just you and I now walking down this road together, but it's you and I with a copy of a map given to us by God. So God has given us a map. We've come to the fork in the road. We consult the map, and the map clearly indicates that we should go to the right. However, you and I, consulting our own faculties of reason, we're suspicious, we're skeptical, we're doubtful. In our own minds, we think we have reason to disagree with taking the right-handed road, and so we want to travel the other road. And so here's where we start to see modernity introducing tension into the ethical Christian age of faith. And unfortunately, it seems that it's very difficult for average people to think about situations like this and perhaps not conclude that secularism is the better path than the path of faith and religion. So I hope I framed that part. What would you say to somebody facing that dilemma?
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, this was very much in the context of Christianity as part of a Christian church, in fact. But I do remember a number of years ago having a number of high school students in my high school Sunday school class, and we were discussing ethics and discussing how do we make decisions in that regard. And presenting what I did in that class was we would present a number of case studies and stories of people having to make decisions, and then we'd present that to them, and I'd ask them what is the right choice in this circumstance. And it was interesting how we would often get disagreement in the class and how to make those decisions. And the materials that we had, obviously, again, coming from a very Christian perspective, were very much focused on that. Yes, we as humans have some ability to make some choices. There are situations that we can consider in making decisions, not wanting to adopt this idea that there is always one very simple answer to every single circumstance, but always that there's always a fence put around the potential answers that we can morally make, that there may be a range of possible reactions to a particular situation that are acceptable, that are within God's law. And then within that range, we certainly have some ability to act, but then there still is this fence that's put around it. And the materials that we use for that class often describe that as love and the law. The law of God creates certain fences that we don't go beyond, but there is still the rule of love, which still gives us some leeway in how we act within certain areas. Now, the question then became often, where are those fences? And that often was the discussion that we had. But it is interesting to think that if we don't necessarily believe that there is a lawgiver, that God is the lawgiver, are we going to have any fences? And I think we've seen in some situations where some people have tried to adopt this law of love without recognizing that the law of love still has a law-giving factor. And so there are those who even use the Bible and use Christ's example as a way to go beyond where many Christians would believe the fences are, because they're so focused on the idea of love that the law piece doesn't go there. But we also found that sometimes there were students who were so focused on the fences and wanting to be so definite about where the fences belonged and being so narrow about the fences that occasionally perhaps they narrowed them further than what scripture really calls for. And then the question becomes, are you really being loving in that circumstance? And what was nice is that now this material that we had was designed to get students thinking. But it is interesting that we see a little bit of that tension, I think, in Christians. And we've talked about this before when we've talked about the theology of Bavinck, where there is a tendency sometimes to go to an antinomianism where there just is no law, and we're just going to go totally based on love. And that means we could go all sorts of directions. But there is also a tendency among Christians to narrow things too much, and I forget that legalism is often the term that gets used. And when we become such legalists, we can often lose love. So, and I know that the professor here isn't really getting into those questions per se, but as this section, both on self-control and on self-interest and rationality, you can read some of that into it. In fact, it's interesting to me as the professor in that last section names 3 different solutions to the idea of self-interest and rationality. He's got Godfrey of Fontaine, who just simply says individual life has a lesser value than the common good for a rationally behaving person. Henry of Ghent objects to that and says that heroic acts arise out of individual considerations, and there is no motivational force besides self-interest. And then you've got the Franciscan authors of the time who have an idea of human freedom that's wide enough to allow the possibility of recognizing other ultimate ends besides one's happiness. And they agree that human beings have a natural tendency to act for their own individual best interest, but that in and of itself is not what morality consists of. And as I was reading that, it harkened back to me to those discussions I had with my students a number of years ago about where do you place those fences? But of course, where do you place those fences can often be, when we ask that question, we are assuming that there is some place, that there are fences to begin with, and that there's a pasture or whatever model you want to use, that where the fences can be laid. And certainly in the medieval times, I think that was understood. But sometimes I wonder whether there's a level at which we even argue anymore about whether fences are a good thing, or whether there is even a place to put these fences. And yeah, that's I think I've probably gotten far away from the original question that you asked, but those are the things that are going through in my mind as we think about those things.